So now I get to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Morrey Davis. Now, I first got to know Morrey as a carpenter because he built what I call my pustinia for me in my backyard. And so you may know Morrey as another important role he has in our community, and that is as the husband of Kara Bradshaw. Or you may know Morrey as one of our teenagers said to me when he saw the poster with Morrey's face on it hanging in our hallway, "That's the smartest man I know." Or you may know Morrey from his academic career, a PhD from Drew University, a longtime professor and dean at Drew University, and a professor at Yale Divinity School, and the author of a book about the United Methodist Church in the Jim Crow era. But I think no matter how you know him, he is a Renaissance man and a public intellectual. So we're so glad, Morrey, that you're in Brevard, and we're also glad that you are our first speaker in our series.
I did not expect a picture of that shed. It's definitely not a shed. Thank you. This is a nice crowd, and I really appreciate everybody being out on an extraordinarily beautiful day. If it just gets to be too much, somebody raise their hand and we'll go play Frisbee. Because it's pretty nice. But thank you. I really do appreciate this many people being here. I'm going to name a couple and take the opportunity to name a few people who came that I really appreciate. One is David Evans sitting up front. 18 years? Known him a long time, and he said I was a mentor of his. It was not that way at all. It went the other direction for sure. So I really appreciate you making the trip to come down. Also, a couple of students from the high school, I won't embarrass them, but today, and I really appreciate that. And then I say this just because they may run out in horror, but my parents are also here. If you see two weeping old people, that's not how we raised him, is what they will be saying. I'm going to start out with a little bit, as in my opinion anyway, as all good historians do, with the present. A couple weeks ago, amidst a flurry of executive orders from the White House, one of them that came down was directly related to the teaching of U.S. history in public schools. I am now teaching U.S. history at a high school, and the language, the guidance from the executive order went something like this. There was a lot in the order, but the critical language said, in any teaching about the origins of the United States, and any teaching about its rise and expansion after that, has to be inspiring and unifying. So, I just want you to know that no matter what you feel today, it's actually inspiring. I promise you, you're really inspired. If you feel unified, even better. So I just want to make sure we got that straight. Keep my job. I also think it's important as a historian, but also just because it's here, to talk about how I came to the topic. And there's a big, despite David being here, and I haven't seen him in a while, and my high school social studies teacher is here, Miss Gary's here, that's also good. Her work on Egypt was inspiring, no doubt. But I think it's important to know how people get to things. I don't pretend to be a scholar who just pulls things out of the air because I think it's interesting or because it's abstract. That's boring. for one thing, but I also think we do ourselves a disservice if we don't pay attention to the questions we have, the questions that our life presents us with, in my case particularly. So I came to Brevard with my family in 1980 from Zambia. My parents were missionaries in Zambia throughout the 70s. And so my life as an American resident really began in that year and began in this town. And it is the many disconnections and gaps that I saw, not necessarily related to this town in particular, but to American life in general, that started in me a series of questions that led to what I thought about in college and led to what I ended up doing in grad school and what I published on and researched on all of my academic career. So I had, like everybody who would come from such a situation, I lived in a communist-run country throughout the 70s. It was pulling itself out of British colonial rule. It had just been a country for about 5-6 years by the time we got there. No, that's not true. It was about 7 years. And it was a very different place, obviously. And so I came here, and there's many things that I remember. I remember the absence of the smell of wood smoke. I remember the smell of tarmac and diesel and gasoline everywhere. And I remember very distinctly more stuff on shelves than I'd ever really imagined in my life. And I still get the hives when I go down a cereal aisle and I don't understand the choice of cereals. And that was about 40 years ago. But other things that were slightly more disturbing to me, and maybe if they were not articulable at the time, they became articulable over the years. To come back from a life in which I went to public school with everyone, where life was not segregated racially in quite the same way as it is here, to come here and to see that all the churches were white or black. Not being able to understand why that was happening. It seemed natural to me that the people who had sent us over there should have had that thing solved here first. That was confusing. And in Brevard, like most places in America, there was a very distinctive black community, Rosenwald, where almost all of the black Brevard community members lived, not all of them. My parents moved to a house right on the edge of Rosenwald, and our neighbor, Eric Cripe, a wonderful human being, I remember when some of my cousins visited that first summer we were there, and I think that was 81 when we were in the house. Some of my cousins came and looked out the window and saw Eric, and used an epithet of surprise to describe him and said, y'all live next to him? As if they could never have imagined that we would choose to do such a thing. So many disconnections between what I imagined a sending benevolent empire would be like versus what I encountered when I got here. Jokes from people, the use of profane language, and for those of you who were here in the 80s and 90s, my memories of my black friends in high school afraid to go to Roslyn when we went to do the Christmas parade with the marching band. A very visceral fear. I remember I was having this discussion with a couple of my friends in the back here not too long ago, that our drum major would plead for all of us. His name was Scotty Wynn, for those of you who know Scotty. He would plead for us to walk around him so that he was always surrounded by white people when we went to do the Christmas parade in Roslyn. I then spent most of my academic life trying to sort out how things like that happen, and how most particularly we are able to talk about ourselves as a nation of liberty, equality for all, and still live in the disconnection. That is the question and the gap that has animated much of what my research and writing and teaching has been about. And that's why I want to talk about James Baldwin today. He, more than any other thinker, really helped me understand that gap. And his prescriptions and his diagnosis for the problem I find the most compelling of anyone else I've read. So that's why we get here, and I'm going to try to not spend too much time, but I want to throw out some of his primary ideas, diagnoses, and what he thinks we have to do. It's also, by the way, since we're starting a speaker series on the life of the mind or hearing from scholars, I think you have to invite people who spend time doing this, and you have to read and you have to expand your mind as much as possible, because we can't be in our bubbles now more than ever. Our bubbles are really destroying us. And finding ways to get outside of that is a must. So I appreciate you all putting your phones down, or as we say in school, leave them outside, and listening for a while. I did not encounter James Baldwin really until graduate school. No one had recommended him to me. I had heard of him. But by the time I got to graduate school, I finally ran into a teacher, Lily Edwards, professor at Drew University, who introduced him to me. And he was able to give me some kind of foothold into the questions that I had. And some of the questions went like this. And Baldwin became kind of a waypoint for that. He addressed in a direct way the problem I've been trying to understand. How is it possible for the story we tell ourselves about America as the benevolent, God-blessed nation, so different from the daily reality, from the facts of its history? Why did it feel like white people always panicked when confronted with the obvious contradictions of their history? Why was it so important to describe the founding and rise to empire of the United States in a frame that only allowed it to be benevolent, exceptional, and divinely chosen? Baldwin stood out for me among many other writers of the Civil Rights Movement because he did not focus on questions of institutional reform. He wasn't against institutional reform, but he did not focus on the sort of, let's move these blocks, let's change this law. That wasn't really his primary focus. Instead, he believed there was a deeper problem, one that could help explain the misalignment between words and action, national myths and reality. And this engaged me because it connected with my own experience. I felt like there was a moral problem here. It's not a system issue, it's not a fix this design, it's a moral problem. First, a little bit of biography about him. He was born in 1924 in Maryland to a 19-year-old mother who never knew who his biological father was. During the Great Migration from southern states to the north, he moved to Harlem with his mother when he was he was born there. His mother moved there, he was born in Harlem. She later married a Baptist preacher named David Baldwin. David's parents had both been born into slavery, and most scholars think that David himself was born enslaved before the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. That always amazes me, by the way, when you look at how close we are to the enslavement era. That James Baldwin, who just died in 1987, and he wasn't even really that old, his stepfather was born in slavery. It's just not that long ago. So his childhood was steeped in the stories from his grandmother and from his father and from his uncles and aunts who had lived on plantations. He was identified very early as a very brilliant young man. In high school, did everything he was supposed to do, learned everything he needed to learn, had some excellent teachers that moved him along. Ironically, he was early on at Frederick Douglass School in Harlem, PS 128. I will come back to that in a minute because we're going to talk about his connection to Frederick Douglass. He also began to struggle in his teens because he realized he was attracted to men, and it worried him, it panicked him. He ended up turning to religion, and by the time he was 14, he became a child preacher. He was a brilliant orator, and he was fully immersed in church and preaching through his teen years. After high school, his family was so poor he could not afford to go to college. He ended up going to New Jersey and helped build military installations in New Jersey. He worked that for 3 or 4 years, finally went back to Harlem. James Baldwin never went to college, not one day. Was as well read as anyone, but he never had a formal college education. By the time he was 24, he was so weary of life here both in terms of his own personal struggles, who he thought he was, but also the daily grind of being a black person in America, the daily grind of feeling the violence and the threats. He decided in order to write, he knew he wanted to be a writer. In order to write, he had to get himself some distance. And quite frankly, he knew he needed safety. So he moved to France in 1948 when he was 24. He, as he says, went there with $40 in his pocket, but spent the next 10 years living in France, making friends, making acquaintances. He finally finished his first novel, which is Go Tell It on the Mountain, in 1953. It was after that he received the Guggenheim Fellowship, which gave him a little bit of financial release. He had a little bit of room to breathe, and he began working immediately on other books. He published Notes of a Native Son, which is nonfiction, 1955. Much of what I will quote to you today comes from that book in particular. And also Giovanni's Room in 1956, which became a fairly successful play in New York as well. In 1957, however, he realized, watching the news, reading newspapers, seeing the photos of what was happening in the United States, watching the pictures of young children as they were screamed at and spit upon going into schools that had just been desegregated, he knew, he said, he had to come back home. He said, I need to take my licks. So he returned to New York in 1957. Unlike other 20th century thinkers that we're more familiar with, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Baldwin tried to engage as directly as possible with white Americans. He rejected what he called a kind of protest literature. He wasn't trying to organize black people to regain their own freedom. He said, the problem is white people. So he tried as best as he could to engage directly with white readers and white listeners. He spoke to a more difficult and fundamental problem, as he perceived it, the soul of the nation, the souls of white folk. And his diagnosis, again, was that America has a moral problem, a deep-seated secret that can only be resolved by a moral reckoning and a full rethinking of who we say we have been, and thus who we are. And he believed that the fate of all Americans, himself and his family included, were bound with all others. He said this in 1962. One may say that the Negro in America does not really exist except in the darkness of white minds. Our dehumanization of the Negro, and notice that slip, he often speaks from the voice of white Americans. Our dehumanization of the Negro, then, is indivisible from our dehumanization of ourselves. This is a key point I'm going to come back to a couple times. Our dehumanization of the Negro, then, is indivisible from our dehumanization of ourselves. There is no surviving the dehumanizing of other people. Yourself does not survive that. Baldwin's latest biographer, Eddie Glaude, who is a brilliant work if you want to know more about Baldwin and haven't read this, his book, Begin Again, is a beautiful book. He has come to refer to this broad cultural problem that Baldwin focused his life's work on as the lie, or the foundational lie of America. And there's several constituent parts of what he calls the lie. One, the historic and continued debasement of non-white peoples as less valuable, less capable, and less human than white people. This point is there in our founding documents, in which we see the familiar lofty language of freedom, liberty, democracy, and all men are created equal. But then a founding constitution that counted enslaved Africans as merely fractionally human, 3/5 to be precise, and where women existed only as population counted toward representation. So this is not only history, this is the present, as we can see clearly in the return to the public eye of marching neo-Nazis and the highly selective deportation of so-called illegals over the last few weeks. Secondly, the lies of American history and the trauma of that the nation has enacted upon people of color all over the planet. These are facts we all know, but we dismiss as mere errors. Indigenous genocide, Japanese internment camps, the very long road to legal equality of women. It's in my lifetime that women were allowed to preach at a Episcopal church, 1974. When I taught briefly at Yale, there's still posters and memorials all over Yale Divinity School advertising how proud they were when they first allowed women to walk into the building. And I say that in a snarky way, but I thought, my goodness. It's not so much that the facts of this history are unknown, but there's much that is not taught adequately and certainly not repeated in public rituals. But it is that these past wrongs are seen simply as momentary failings or mistakes or accidents of another time when people held different views. Oh, they just saw it differently back then. Well, let's just remember there's never been a time where there weren't abolitionists. There's never been a time when everybody thought it was great to own someone else. That doesn't exist. We know them, these facts, but we refuse to allow them to change the basic story. And thus the story of who we are is not fully true. Take the example of the Confederacy as a perfect example of this second constituent point. Even when I was in high school, and I won't name names, but my U.S. history teacher certainly used the phrase, the lost cause and the war between the states. That was how we learned about the Confederacy and about the Civil War, that it was just a feud amongst brothers. The slavery issue was secondary. This was all about states' rights, somehow pretending that states' rights isn't some sort of cover-up for what we know what it really is, which is states' rights to own people. That's certainly what I was still taught when I was in our state. The Charlottesville incident of 2017?
Yep.
2017. Why did people get so mad about statues? Why do statues matter so much? Why does it matter that Robert E. Lee still gets to be there up there even though he lost? People died that day over the idea that the South and the flag of the Confederacy is merely just about a way of life. Baldwin saw it this way from an essay in 1964, which he called The White Problem. The people who settled this country had a fatal flaw. They could recognize a man when they saw one. They knew he wasn't anything else but a man. But since they were Christian, and since they had already decided that they came here to establish a free country, the only way to justify the role this chattel was playing in one's life was to say that he was not a man. For if he wasn't, then no crime had been committed. That lie is the basis of our present trouble, he said. One of the things that Baldwin helps me do in this recent political turmoil that has its own particular character. We're always in political turmoil, let's not pretend this has never happened before. But the current political turmoil in it has a very certain cast about towards the truth. And what I think Baldwin helps us understand is that we are, as a nation, a very experienced bunch of liars. And that we are a very experienced population used to seeing lies and being able to accept them despite what we see on the other side. That the relationship between what we know and what we feel compelled to uphold is a very fraught one. And it goes all the way back to the very things that we had to do in the very beginning to say that it was all right, we're still a country that's free even though we own people. One of the most devastating consequences of the development of this theology of human enslavement is that the inheritors of this theology are trained in it. And thus we know how to, and practice how to, morally justify the dehumanization of anyone. It has become an American tradition to understand and use the theological mechanisms of lifting ourselves up at the expense of others. And Baldwin believed the only way that America could find its way out of its trouble was to deal directly and honestly with those stories of the past. And to quote him again, to accept one's past, one's history is not the same thing as drowning in it. It is learning how to use it. An invented past can never be used. I'm going to say that one again. An invented past can never be used. If you're not telling the story the way it really happened, it doesn't work. It cracks and crumbles under the pressures of life like clay in a season of drought. How, he asked, can the American Negro's past be used? The unprecedented price demanded is the transcendence of the realities of color, of nations, and of altars. Baldwin, despite not having a college degree, was really good at illusions. In No Name in the Street, which was published in 1972, Baldwin wrote, "What one does not remember is the serpent in the garden of one's dreams. What one does not remember is the serpent in the garden of one's dreams." Even though he was writing 50 and 60 years ago, he understood a lot about the way trauma works. And his view of trauma is consistent with contemporary science and trauma, particularly a recent field of research in which biologists are realizing that trauma can be carried epigenetically. That is to say, terrible things happen to you. It can change the way your genes interact with your DNA, and that cannot be resolved, and it can be passed on. Much of this research was done on families and those who were the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, trying to understand how what happened to those in the Holocaust passed down the effects of the horrible torture, death of their friends and family, famine, starvation, brutality, and the way in which it affected their inheritors. Trauma can alter the way our genes function, and they can be inherited. What happened to our ancestors, suffering the dehumanizing of enslavement, for instance, or the self-dehumanization of owning, raping, torturing, murdering another person while telling yourself you live in a free country, can have consequences carried out to our present day. And here I want to go back to my mention of Frederick Douglass, because the last thing I said was it's also possible that your dehumanization of someone else can traumatize you. You are not a full person. Frederick Douglass knew this when he was writing in the 1840s. Frederick Douglass, the author of 3 autobiographies, the first, which was published in the mid-1840s, was a line-by-line, heavily detailed account of his life as an enslaved person, his escape out of it, and in his rise as an abolitionist in the 1840s. Douglass spares no one, but also continues to have affection and empathy for everyone in the stories that he tells. The most early in that first autobiography is a story about a woman who married into the family where he was enslaved. So he had been inherited by a young man. That young man married. That woman he married had never owned anyone before. And so he describes what happens. He was a young man. He was 10 or 11 years old. And this woman comes into his life. And he said, for the first time, a white person looked at me and smiled. And he said, I didn't understand what was happening. So for weeks and months, this woman treated him well. She even decided to try and teach him the alphabet. One day, her husband came home, realized she was teaching him to read, screamed at her, chastised her, and told her never to do that again. After that day, says Douglass, her entire personality changed. She no longer looked him in the face. She no longer smiled at him. And he describes the slow degradation over months and then years of her as a person who addressed him as another person and then stopped. She could not stay in the system and understand him as a full person. The dehumanization hurt the white people as much as it did him, he said. And this is Douglass's point in the book. White people, you have to do this if for no other reason than for yourselves. He tells another story, and he spends a lot of time talking about this in his book. He tells another story about how many children were born of women who were slaves, who were fathered by their owners. And he talks about how there's this relationship when the child is born, this secret relationship where it's obvious because of skin color that the child is probably the child of the owner. And that the wife in the situation has to pretend that that's not some indication of malfeasance on the part of her husband, and that the child plays with the other slave children, and they become friends, and they have a life together, and they're cousins, and they don't know it, but by the time they get to be 10, 11, 12 years old, the father takes the child and takes him out of the house and moves him into the field and never talks to him again. While his half-brother in the plantation house remains. Douglas talks about this not in relation necessarily to the young child who returned to the fields, but to that young white boy who had to be forced to pretend he no longer loved his brother. There is something that happens inside a person, says Douglas, that breaks you if you are required to dehumanize other people. And if stepping out of that system means you lose everything else, most people are not going to do it. So that young white boy of 10, 11, 12 years old was never, for the most part, going to remember that that was his brother that he lost. And the father was never going to mention them. So everyone had to keep the system going, and that's how it works. But he says the trauma invested in that carries on. Baldwin agreed and said that if we don't go back and confront these stories and deal with them in a way that fully encapsulates both what we think is good about the language of the Constitution, but also the reality of the ways in which it played out, then our capacity to tell the truth and move on morally from that will never happen. His biographer Glaude said it this way: what happens is we pine then for national rituals of expiation that wash away our guilt without the need for an admission of guilt, celebrating Martin Luther King Jr. Day or pointing to the election of Barack Obama in a process we might call historical gaslighting. In other words, you can be happy that Barack Obama got elected, but if you think it changed everything, you're wrong. Baldwin said this in 1968, history, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read. It does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us. It's with great pain and terror that one begins to realize this. One enters into battle with that historical creation, oneself, and attempts to recreate oneself according to a principle more human and more liberating. So how might we even begin to address such foundational resetting of our relationship to being American, to the reciprocity that is necessary in the maintenance of our own individual identities as good people who live in a nation that is inherently good? The first step, Baldwin tells us, is to be open to the painful process of acknowledging the level of our own self-deceit and the necessity of aligning our stated values with the presentation of our history. You don't mean your values if you don't apply it to the way you tell the story of the facts we all know. The difficulty, he acknowledges, is that there is a kind of trauma in realizing that we are the descendants of kidnappers and racists and sex traffickers. As Baldwin put it, I imagine that one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they'll be forced to deal with real pain. There is trauma in realizing, perhaps one day, all in a flash, that the stories you've been told all your life, the history you were taught in school, inspirational, don't forget, the statues you were told to revere, the heritage and cultural gifts you were told to be grateful for, were all based on a lie. Not just one lie, but a whole web of half-truths, public rituals, missing facts, convenient and soft language, myths. It should be traumatic to learn that J.P. Morgan Bank accepted slaves as collateral for loans. They hold my mortgage, I gotta get a credit card from them. Or that AIG and Aetna, who now holds the state employees' our health insurance, are among those companies that offered insurance to enslavers. A full accounting of U.S. history, told in all its complexity, should change us all. It is a shock to realize that we've been had. It's a trauma to realize that the myths teach us that when we begin to question them, we are unpatriotic, even traitors to our country. There is so much to be lost by asking the question. But if there is any real patriotism in a nation that is good, then the people of that nation will be unafraid of what's true. In fact, they will of necessity face the past and thus the present with new intention to apply the values we hold dear to the facts that we already know. It's through a moral reassessment of who we say we were that we can become who we say we are. And Baldwin tells us that if we feel a panic at the prospect of a true reckoning, if you feel a panic inside yourself at being corrected about something, that is the evidence of things unseen. If you feel a panic that it's not what you thought it was, that's the evidence of things unseen. That is the sign that you are wounded, that we all are wounded, and that we have been wounding ourselves. We are vulnerable, and there's no one to repair us but ourselves. I could do that all day about James Baldwin, but I'm going to end it and hope if you do want to talk about any of this, any of these ideas, any of Baldwin's work, I'd be happy to do that and answer questions. I know that's not a candy, sweet little Sunday afternoon treat I just handed you. But I also feel like we live in weird times, and I don't really have time to play around. So, happy to talk and happy to hear what you might have questions about. I got it right here. Did you want to have mics for people?
I don't know if we have this.
Oh, sure.
It's on.
All right. People with hearing aids.
In my estimation, the people in this room are not the people who need to hear what you're saying.
Great, let's go.
And considering our nation's history by what we all thought were great Americans, writing Constitution and policies, who most had a hand in the probably dehumanization of people. And it's been so long, this pain body has been with us so long. I'm wondering what your opinion is as far as, is it easier for a human being to deal with the pain of it or the hate of it?
Yeah. Hate is easy. Hate is very easy. The pain of it comes in two ways. One is accepting that you might have just been saying, believing whatever the wrong thing for a while. That's one. The other is that holding things in a complex way is extremely difficult for everybody. And so what I'm not saying is that all bad or all good. That's not the answer. That's not what Baldwin's saying. The problem comes when you can't rectify all men are created equal with what exactly is happening. There is a complex story that allows everyone to keep going. There is a complex story that is a hopeful one. Why? Because it's the realistic one. There is actually, and I was joking at the beginning about inspiration and unifying and hope, but there is actually only hope in just telling the truth. There isn't hope in continuing to pretend or to hold back from saying what's hard. So hate is easy because you know what to do already, and it's right there, and it feels right, and it's immediate. It's like a dopamine hit. But holding things in complexity and holding things to things, because this is, right? Y'all, I don't want to say anything about the age of the room. Y'all know things are complicated. You always have to hold two things in opposition together if you're going to get through things. You have to. And so the history that Baldwin wants us to tell is the one that does that. But it's harder. I agree with you. It might not look to say that. We had another person.
Hello, first of all, thank you. Secondly, I cry for you, because your way ahead is gonna be really hard in the profession that you're in right now.
I'm fine.
No, but I know what can come up. What I'm envisioning are classes that we hold for our young people and for ourselves in our churches, that we develop some kind of a curriculum that is going to augment whatever deficiencies in the truth, in the history that is our history, and what we can do to further that. Because I see this as being a community problem that needs to be resolved, not just one that's in one single history teacher's pocket.
Absolutely.
And without us back there and doing things that support you in a very real material way, not just with funds, but with actual work on the pavement, it can then be inspiring. And it can there be, life-changing.
Thank you. And it's worth noting, I'm not just talking about classrooms. Most of the history that we live day to day is in symbols, road names, names of cities, songs, public rituals, prayers before Congress. It's went to a family funeral last Saturday and drove downtown Lawrence, South Carolina, and they've still got their monument to the boys in gray. I think there's probably a more complicated way to talk about that, but it's still there. So it's the larger landscape that we encounter as history all day long. What things look like, what things are called. Donald Trump asked the right question last year. Well, what are we going to do about Washington? If we're going to get rid of so-and-so and so-and-so and so, what about Thomas Jefferson and George Washington? No, that's right. No, you're asking the right question. What do we do with that? I don't know yet what the answer is, but that's a real question. So yes, I appreciate also the words of support.
I remember watching Baldwin, and he said that we always see blacks will raise themselves up. He was saying whites have to raise themselves up. He reversed the whole thing that we always heard. But my question is about, in terms of Baldwin, this passionate attack on diversity, DEI. It's not just criticism, it's a passionate attack. And I'm beginning to think that really they're attacking Baldwin. They're attacking basic anti-racism part, because that's what it's about. What it sounds good on the outside, you're going too far. They're really attacking the question of diversity and what you're talking about. Isn't that the truth? Isn't that attack what's going on now? Doesn't it have racist roots? Isn't it an attack on people, what Baldwin saying?
Yes, in a larger array of attacks on what it means to be American, for instance. Like, I think in context, that's exactly right. And I don't, for instance, we're now going to be accepting white refugees from South Africa.
Really?
So, there's some belief in DEI. So I think the targets of the particular purges around DEI are the clue to what's behind it, which was a rejection of what. Now I never read Baldwin to beg for any place he didn't merit, right? That wasn't really his cause. But there's a kind of spirit to the attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion programs that feels that it's more than it looks like. I agree with that. Yes.
When the first question came up and suggested you might be preaching to the choir, you said, "Let's go." Where are we going?
I want to get outside. It's really nice out. Now we're sweet and everything. No, I really appreciate the on-the-ground question, because the kind of things I'm describing this is not something you get with a protest. This is not something that you get with laws changed. I mean, I do think there are some things to be done about school curriculum and who controls what's said in schools. That's maybe a separate but absolutely related project. I have to say that it's the daily repetition of myth that makes it most powerful. So what are the ways that we talk about the past that we just are used to talking about the past? What are the ways that we discuss our ancestors, or what are the ways that we talk about George Washington? You know, what do we say about what's on our money? Again, not saying George Washington gets disappeared. That's not my point. That's pointless, actually. You get rid of the history of the founding person, and it actually makes it worse. So what I'm not calling for some sort of organization in that way, but not say there's not a space for that. But all of us, in the daily way in which we repeat who we are, in our interactions with everyone, that we are always highly conscious of what story we're telling about ourselves that reflects who we imagine we are as a community. There's a relational aspect to it. There's a way in which we have to listen. I had a clip pulled up that I didn't play because it just didn't feel right when I got there on the paper. It's a clip of Baldwin on the Dick Cavett show. He did a really good interview. A lot of you may have seen that if you followed Baldwin stuff. It's almost as good as the William F. Buckley debate, which he had at Cambridge. If you really like Baldwin, that's a great thing to go watch. But in that clip that I was going to show, Baldwin gets the response that civil rights leaders always got, and to be frank, stuff I gotten over many, many years of talking about race in public, where people says, well, aren't you just focusing on this too much? You know, I mean, we already got the civil rights movement. Like Barack Obama's president, there's the gaslighting thing. You know, what are you worried about? You're making it worse by talking about it. What I love about the clip is that Baldwin says, you might feel comfortable, but I don't. You have to listen. So, where are we going? I'm just ready to listen to people again. To not discount someone because it doesn't make sense to you. If someone in town says, I've been living in Roosevelt my whole life and I don't walk downtown Brevard to go to a restaurant, you better listen to that one, right? That's the kind of stuff we have to not dismiss because it makes us uncomfortable. There's a panic that rises in white people. This is Baldwin's language. There's a panic that rises in white people when things are pointed out to us that we don't like, and we insist to both ourselves and to others, well, that can't be true. There's no police keeping you from walking downtown and going to a restaurant. But if we don't understand what it means to be blocked from something without a police baton, then we're not paying attention, right? The subtle things that happen every day that we have to keep our ears and our hearts open to. And it'll help us tell the story differently, I say, as a white person. But if you have an organization in mind, let me know. I mean, we'll talk about it. Yes, please.
Have you felt free to discuss the actual history of the United States with your students? And have you seen, what have you seen in terms of the response or differences over the years?
So, great question. I pretty much teach what I want. I'm too old to play around. Like I don't have time for it. And now I feel bad because I had another career and I have a retirement fund. You know, I'm not a young teacher who can barely afford to rent an apartment in Brevard, so I have a little bit of room to be snarky like that. And I know that. I admit that openly. I can find something else to do. So I try my best to say what I think as much as possible. I'm not, because I think this is actually fair, I don't talk about electoral politics very much in class. That's not appropriate. I try my best not to do that. I have slipped many times. But as a rule, that's not something I do. I don't think that's fair. But let me tell you, there are opportunities. For example, when it's the law of unintended consequences. What an executive order does is allow you to talk about the executive order in class. So when I'm told that I have to be inspiring, then we have a discussion in class about whether or not this is inspiring. I mean, without being glib, you can talk about whatever you want if you do it the right way. So in my position though, again, I have a bank account, I have a retirement fund, I feel like I can do that and not worry that I'm losing my house. But I also think, for the most part, students are receptive to someone pointing out things that are simply inconsistent. Yes, I hear students, as they should, miming back to me what they hear at home all the time. But there's no reason that you can't demonstrate a way of thinking. There's no reason that you can't model a way of thinking through a particular situation that's not manipulative or overly coercive with a teenager. And I do that. That's what I do. We also had a great opportunity last week. I try my best to use textbooks because they're on screens all day long. So I drug out the U.S. history textbooks out of some dusty closet somewhere that no one was using, and was ready to start Unit 1, which in the table of contents of the book, Unit 1 starts in the ancient civilizations of the Americas, and it moves through the conquistadors and all the stuff that, the 400 years of stuff that happens before you get to the appearance of America. Those pages are gone, all of them. So again, there's an opportunity. Like it's not like, oh shoot, I can't talk about anything before 1776. No, I go, hey, look at the table of contents. Look where the pages start. What's happening here? We're talking about it. So, you're gonna play those kind of games, you're gonna see who wins. And in that case, you gave a perfect opportunity to talk about why the state of North Carolina might remove the first 135 pages of the U.S. history textbook. And yet it's still on the table of contents. Let's talk about it. I don't know. What do you think? But again, I have
Back here.
Sam.
Family, my
Oh,
father.
sorry, right here. Go ahead.
Anyway, my father was a Lutheran minister and he started.
Can't hear you.
churches.
Can't hear you.
Wait a minute.
Give him the
microphone.
Hang on.
Anyway, this is what I'm gonna say. I don't know what to do about this situation. Anyway, my father was a Lutheran minister. He started the church here, and then he started Lutheran churches across the South. When I grew up, we were in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which was the most racist place in the United States. And that's what I grew up with. But my father, we were a very liberal family in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And we were for integration when it was all segregated. This was before 1964. So I always grew up with that. The other side of my family, and I've often wondered about what we should do about the other side of my family. You said Baldwin's relatives were born on a plantation. My grandmother, who lived in Charlotte, who lived to be 100, her mother was born on a plantation, and she was not black. So I come from a family that owned plantations. But growing up, we were very much for changing the South and moving away from a segregated South that the Democrats did. And I'm a Democrat.
Well, that was back in the days. Things were different.
My mother's family were Democrats during the Civil War and supported slavery.
Right.
And we stayed Democrat. When I grew up in Brevard, everybody was a Democrat, and everything was segregated. And if you wanted to run for office, you were a Democrat. Then it all flipped with Nixon to Republicans because, Lyndon Johnson passed the racial, he was the one that passed the 64, 65. So everybody became Republicans. Now you go all over the South, there's nothing but Republicans. So things haven't changed, just the name of the party. But anyway, I guess my thought is, families like mine that have been here since, well, in North Carolina since 1750. The original plantation houses outside of Salisbury, the museum. What should we do? Should we apologize?
I don't think apology is the point at all.
Huh?
You didn't do anything.
No,
You know, I think
personally-
apology is not the point. I think explain to me, and this is, I mean it, I don't think apologies are the point.
That's what I was wondering.
I think the point is that you don't stop talking about what you just told.
Okay.
Look, you're fine, right? You didn't die by talking about how your plantation ancestors owned people. You're okay. It doesn't destroy a person to admit where you come from,
Okay.
right? That's my point. There's been apologies everywhere. Like even AIG and JP Morgan Chase have apologized.
Yeah.
Now, did they change their policies of profit first?
Sam.
At any cost? No, but they apologized. Do you feel better? I don't feel any better. Like, I don't understand. So I think exactly what you're doing, which is to say, this is where I come from. This is the story and I think stories have a ritual character and they're powerful in just their telling. And I think you tell the story of where you came from and that you're still okay. Like, it doesn't change who you are, but it changes how you understand where you came from. That's got liturgical power. Can I say liturgical power? I mean, stories have a power, and they get to be told over and over again. Sometimes they need to be told more than once. Sam's back.
Morrey, thank you. I wanted to publicly ask you about something that I brought up to you privately, which was.
I feel nervous.
Well, hear what you have to say. So my family's from Tennessee, and I was born there, but I had the very unique experience and privilege of being raised in Harlem, in New York. And so the knowledge I had growing up as a 10-year-old, speaking with many of the elderly black people in Harlem who were born in the 20s and 30s, they had moved there during the Great Migration, many, or were first generation in New York, was that they were, when you asked, where are you from? It wasn't New York, it was North Carolina and Mississippi and Alabama. And I didn't have many friends whose families were from the South, and so that was actually something I really picked up on as a kid. When I moved here, there's this narrative about who's from here, who's not from here. And I think there's validity to that, and there's things for people like me who didn't grow up here and move here to learn from that. But I think that this question of who's from here is only as valuable as asking who's from here but not here because of racial violence and economic alienation. So both from you, from your scholarship, also from growing up here, I'm curious how you can contribute to that narrative, and maybe what Baldwin could contribute to that narrative if there's some reading I should do to learn about that.
So do you say the question again, which is here, not here? Explain that a little bit more.
I'm reflecting on if somebody in, for example, the local political context is making the argument that people who are from here should have X role in the conversation. It just reminds me of how many people grew up in Brevard or other parts of the South, but were black and went to somewhere like where I grew up in Harlem because of racial violence or economic alienation, and they don't get to be a part of the political discourse here.
Yeah.
And how do we weave that narrative and understand that?
Thank you. Now I understand where your question is. That's a super question. We all suffer, whether we're native or not, from a kind of weird expulsion of non-native thinking in this county. As if the Cherokee didn't get pushed out here, all that kind of stuff. Like that whole native thing just drives me nuts. and talk about living in a world that has nothing to do with the facts of history, to use a word like native and imagine. I mean, it's preposterous. But we're not gonna get that far, like in a practical way. So your point is a really good one, and I think there is Baldwin is one of those voices speaking back to where he was a native. And for a place to read, Notes of a Native Son is exactly a great place to start. That's his second book, and it's nonfiction. He's responding to what he calls, and I brought this up just once, I think, protest writing. He doesn't do protest writing. Someone came in earlier, I think it was you, Ms. Luff, where were you? She said he's a little bit of a mystic thinker in that case, and I think that's right. He thinks there's a soul of a place, and that's what the issue is. And so in that book, he gets to that, and he gets at this question of native, and what does it mean to be the person who can tell the story of a place. I would start there. I also think Evidence of Things Unseen, which is one of his last books, and where I got the title for today, where he goes down and investigates the murders of some young black women in Atlanta in the 80s. He talks about it there as well, this question. Yeah, what does it mean to say you're from here? I mean, for me, do you care about it? Are you here? You know, are you invested? Does your story, which yours, I mean, yours is such a great example, your family story, like, this is where your heritage is, down here. You have a lot to say about it because you left and because you looked at it from outside. And that's what Baldwin's practice was, is every time he really needed to say and think and write what needed to be said and thought and write, he moved out of the country. He was in France for 10 years, he was in Turkey for almost 10 years. Did some of his best work and then realized he needed to go back home, you know. Never felt like that was his home. This was always home, but sometimes he had to walk away and get some space. Is he native because he left? Right. I think I'm getting to the point of your question. I hope so. Do you have microphones? Oh, you do.
Yes, thank you. I moved to Brevard when I was 2 with my dad, with mom, who worked for DuPont. And I graduated Brevard High School in 1972, and in 1971, I rode the bus of the Brevard High School band with black majorettes, they were called then. Extremely afraid of going into Roswell for the Christmas parade. I'm also a graduate of Drew University later. Yeah.
That's 4 of us.
Yeah, that's weird. Is it that we're just comfortable with a revisionist history as a people, or we're just afraid of doing this moral reassessment? Or is there something else that causes such opposition to reparations? When I hear that word, I see people, white people, turn red in the face. I didn't own slaves. I don't know anybody. I don't need to apologize. But reparations are trying to do something to make it right, to arrest it. So, and I'm from Asheville now, and we've had a massive movement over there, and it's gone quiet.
Yeah. No, it's a great question, and I do think many conversations like this stop in their tracks when people think they're going to have to claim that money. Absolutely. So that's a really good point, and in terms of what are the things that stop people? But let's also say that out loud again. Like, are you unwilling to tell the truth because of money? And I think that's the value question that's involved in what we're doing. You're willing to say, I get it, you know, we're not telling the story right, but it could really cost me. And I gotta buy groceries too. I'm not saying that's not important. But we need to be honest about that one. Money's too far. Right? I'm willing for us to get back to a vision of who we are as a place, but money I'm not willing to do. You know, I can be, and for any of you who work for them, JP Morgan Chase, and still have money that came from the owning of people in the 19th century, but apologies is about all I can do. And if that's what we're doing, let's just be honest. Again, if you're not telling the truth about why you're saying yes or no, then that's when we have the moral problem. And that's what Baldwin kept trying to say was, you can't just keep pretending it isn't true. You can't just keep telling in a way that doesn't align with who you say you are. Otherwise, it's all going to crumble. I love his image of clay in a dry desert. That's a made-up history. It's worthless and it'll do nothing for you. Reparations, other places have talked about it. South Africa has a very difficult but fascinating approach to how they have dealt with apartheid. They have had real public conversations. And that is, ironically, exactly why the refugees from South Africa are involved. Did I get at your question?
As a young clergy, I was sent to, and I agreed to do it and all that, but to Chicago to be trained under Saul Alinsky.
Oh, yeah.
Great community organizer. And Saul Alinsky, which also Barack Obama did that, Saul Alinsky said, no one does anything unless it's in their own self-interest.
Yep.
Period.
Yep.
Of course, I had a hard time with that. But as I've lived through life, it's pretty true. Nobody does anything unless it's in their own self-interest. So when you community organize, I don't know if Baldwin would agree with that.
I think you would absolutely agree with that. I think that's exactly why Baldwin says to white people, if you don't do this, you're doomed. The self-interest is survival. And he means that on both the spiritual level, but also if you want the United States to continue as a powerful place, you better get your stuff together. He meant it when he said, and this is why I really feel like I align with him. You can't build a society on lies. You can't build a society on half-truths. You cannot get so used to telling lies that you lose track of what you're saying. You cannot continue to embrace a certain value that is not reflected in the way you tell your own story, or the way that you admit to or are able to see with depth and empathy and honesty what happened 150 years ago. You don't have to go that far. That, to me, is the self-interest.
I have a brief question. My voice carries. Barack Obama was half white and raised by a white family, and he was our first black president. It has always rankled me that no one ever said, yeah, but.
I think that's the pernicious logic of race law. There is no such thing as when you can be white and you can be black. Right? A white woman can have a black baby. A white woman can have, but a black woman cannot have a white baby. Right? So the racial logic is its own pernicious cycle. It's hard to say our first mixed race president. I guess maybe it's too thick off the tongue. I don't know, but yes.
Yeah, I have a question. In terms of backlash or people's reaction, do you think that people would have reacted differently if we got rid of all of the Daughters of Confederacy statues first and not questions Washington and Jefferson? Just deal with the Southern generals in the Civil War that lost, got rid of them, the heroes of the lost cause first. And also, in terms of reparations, if we didn't start with slavery, if we started with redlining, the banks making money off of this, and go backwards in time. I mean, like black farmers not getting the loans and the money from Department of Agriculture 10 years ago.
Right. So you're asking the strategy question about do you go for the whole thing or do you try and chip away to get people on board? I mean, I think you're right in terms of the Confederate stuff, I mean, I think that was definitely the strategy. I don't think any towns have taken down a Washington statue yet. And I'm not even sure I'm the advocate for that. I mean, maybe you just change the sign on the Washington statue. First president. Owned this many people. I don't know. I think there's ways to pretending it didn't happen is not the answer. Like pretending. I think I lost my mind. Pretending that there was no Civil War or that there was no Robert E. Lee is not the answer. Putting him up on a statue, saying he was a great guy or represented a great cause, that's different. So I think it's all about what interpretive moves we continue to make. The redlining thing, I mean, I totally agree with that one. That's not even something most people are, that doesn't get taught much in schools. But I'm not allowed to say systemic racism in school anymore either, so I can't, that's also in the executive order. You can't use the word systemic racism.
I have a question. Go back to your self-interest.
Yes, sir.
Is it better to implement the golden rule or to perpetuate man's humanity to me?
Now you're asking me to be a theologian.
I think that's what all of this boils down to, how we treat one another.
Can you say it again for everybody? I don't think everybody heard exactly what you said. Do you mind? It was the mic wave a little bit.
Okay, go for it.
What I said was, is it talking about your self-interest? Is it better to implement the golden rule or to perpetuate man's inhumanity to me?
That's a great discussion. Maybe that's what we put at the bottom of the Washington statue.
Speak of.
They have a mic up good. There we go.
Thank you. So I feel like we've touched a number of times on an aspect, and it sounds like Baldwin focuses a lot on a social, moral aspect of this, but I'm curious if he speaks directly to, or if you have thoughts on the economic system that underlies all of this and the benefit, capitalism is what drove all of this seeking profit, JP Morgan, Chase, all of the plantation owners, and I wonder if he addresses whether the social and moral reckoning needs to come with an economic reckoning or is powerful enough to overcome the inherent inequality that is built into capitalism.
Yep, thank you. Great question. Yes, absolutely. And that's exactly where Martin was going. And I'll make another recommendation if you want to know more about Baldwin. There's a super, it's not even really a documentary because it's all of Baldwin's words. It's called I Am Not Your Negro. It's on Netflix.
Yeah, we've seen it here.
It's pretty brilliant. But it's all about Baldwin, Martin, and Malcolm, as he always talked about, both of them. And the gaslighting version of Martin that we get is pretty benign. It gets used in commercials. The end of MLK Jr.'s life, he was decidedly a critic of global capitalism in its present state. And he understood that is what connected poor white people in the South. That is what connected people in other countries. Like that is what connected the freedom movement on the continent of Africa to the civil rights movement in the United States. That's where he was headed. And then he was assassinated. Baldwin thought it was all over at that point. He actually attempted suicide a few months after Martin was assassinated. He went through a couple of years of a real deep hopelessness. But he came back around this very question, and it goes to this question about the banks that still exist who are operating off reserves from the 19th century. And that is it really going to be money in the end? Is that the thing that really holds this all together? And is that the main value that we hold? If that's it, let's just call it and go. And that is precisely where he was. And for him, it was part of the moral degradation of all of us, that we were unable to see that in an indirect way, Martin was killed by profit. That people were really getting nervous about what he was saying and his criticisms of the Vietnam War. And this gets back to what's hard, what's more painful, to keep hating or to try and figure out another way to understand the past, and that is, it's hard to be called a traitor. It's hard to be said you're not being patriotic, why don't you just leave? That's a hard thing to hear, no matter who it's from. And when you start talking about the profit motive, then people start talking, well, we'll go somewhere else. Also, it gets diminished. Well, then go to a communist country. Well, that's not the point, That's not the point. There's not an A or B, one thing or the other option on the economic menu. I mean, I could go a lot. This is lecture 2. We want to have a book club meeting.
I wish you could.
We'll take you up on that. Will you lead our book club?
Hello. You're gonna realize very quickly. You're gonna realize very quickly that I have an accent.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. I've been in rooms like this one a lot of times. Thank you for what you said today. It was beautiful. I am familiar with the teachings of Baldwin. I have read a couple of books. But when I'm in rooms like this one, I try not to talk. What happens is everybody here really cares. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. Unfortunately, a lot of times, is it about money? Is it what everybody wants? And I am not authorized to speak from anybody, but I am seeing, at least my community, the Latino community, what is that we want? Is that money? No, we don't want money. We are very capable to make our own money. Basically, what we want is leave us alone. Most of us are hard workers. Most of us have a family, have the same beliefs than any other people here. And a lot of the beliefs that we have are very similar to those to the Republican Party. What happens in rooms like this when I don't know how many you have, but I can almost see it duplicated everywhere. You will have a hard time understanding right now if I start speaking Spanish, or if I start speaking Italian. Unless you are Hispanic or Italian, you probably, or you learn, you probably won't understand. And it's very similar in the sense to try to understand racism, what the Latino or the person who's being discriminated goes through, simply because you don't speak the same language, meaning you're not the same person. You haven't gone through those problems. Till today. So, sorry, my question. What people can do here is, well, if I'm wrong, please let me know. I use him like a very smart guy. See the problem not through your own eyes. See the problem not through your own skin. Is that something that is possible for you guys to do? See who we are as the Latino, Black, Asian, call it whatever you want, people. Would it be possible for everybody to see the other person as a human being? The way that I find out that it's easier for me, by the way, from Argentina, if you know a little bit of history, we're not the best, especially after the World War II. We're just gonna leave it at that. But many in this room, many people will find a little bit of curiosity to find out the first slaves in this country, way back then, were white people. It wasn't the black people, it wasn't anybody else, it was white people. People that were incarcerated in England, they came here to work. So, understanding the history of how racism became racism, why you guys are called the Caucasians. That it's just a made-up word, just because somebody found a skull somewhere else and it was beautiful. So my question, I'm sorry, I just went on a rampage. If you had the power to write something as meaningful as Baldwin did today, knowing everything that is happening, the turmoil that we're in today, in today's era, what would you write in your book that would change somebody else's mind?
I really enjoyed it drawing. Cookies on the side.
Just heard the third lecture.
You just got right to it. Thank you. You can apologize all you want. They didn't change it. That is a wonderful question, and it is one that has haunted me. I left. I gave a 10-year and moved down here because I felt like what I was doing in that context was nothing, basically, and very little impact is what it felt like to me. I mean, I would love to be wrong about that, but one of the reasons I left is that I did not feel like what I was writing and what I was doing, and I've been working on these topics for 3 decades almost. So I've been haunted, just your short answer, I've been haunted by the question, how exactly do I write what I want to write that I think will actually make a difference with the people who I think want to hear it. And some version of what I just said, yeah, but there's a lot more to it. I mean, this was a 20-minute thing, but some version of what I said. Baldwin was right. There's not a world in which, let me start this way. Common trope in American cinema is a secondary character in a film who's a wise old black man who comes around and tells the white people how to solve it. That doesn't happen in real life. And when the problem, and I don't mean there's not wise black men, that's not my point. My point is what Baldwin was saying. There's no black people without white people, there's no white people without black people. White people got to figure out their end of the thing now. Which is to say, be willing to hear things they don't want to hear, be willing to rethink what they thought they knew, including me every day, including being open to more stories than we thought we understood. There's always something else. So if I had to write the book that has haunted me for the last 4 years, it'd be something like that. But it would be really good and people would not get mad. And they'd go, "Aw, he's right." And then I'd be happy. I appreciate your question very much and the way you came at it. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm sure Morrey is willing to hang around and talk, continue talking, not rushing off for the Super Bowl quite yet. Thank you all again for coming, and look for flyers and information about our coming presentations throughout the year. Thank you again.